consortium of professionals from different subjects like climate and economics and others that basically introduced the problem of climate change to the world and won a Nobel Prize for that. I don't see it here. No, it was working before, but I don't. Maybe you see it, and then no, the computer is here.
Okay, let's see if we can go to the page modified thing there.
But I don't have the mouse is not working. So vertical. Okay, so just to finish, Professor Stelner published about that book on those topics, and full screen you go over here. Yes, here you go. And his topic is one of the urgent ones, the actual with the current administration. So I will not take more of your time, please.
Okay, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Israel. I'm very excited. And I'm sorry I have to speak in English. Next time I'll speak in English. Okay. So this will, you are all economists, I take it. This will be a fairly general. I mean, I'm really reporting on a financial event analysis, but I will have a very long introduction and a very long conclusion discussion. I won't spend much of the time on the actual sort of study. I have a PhD student who is doing that. I'm not a financial economist. For me, that is a method, and it's an interesting method, and we have developed econometric methods that are interested in relationship to this. But my main interest is in the context. And the financial event study is about, well, it started off being about the Paris negotiation. You all know about the Paris negotiations on the climate. The question is, did they achieve anything? When we were doing this study, we didn't find much of an effect. That's actually one of the conclusions. We didn't find very much of an effect of the signing of the Paris Agreement on financial markets. We were looking at coal shares and that kind of thing. And people said, well, but it was perhaps anticipated. As we were doing this study, something unanticipated happened. They elected a bit of a surprise as president in the United States. So this was a perfect, not from every point of view, but from the point of view of our study, because it was unanticipated and it was clear that it was going to be good for fossil fuels. So it provided us. So we now look at two events, the Paris Agreement and the Trump election. And now first, not stop working, but I guess we should have this door open because it wants to communicate with this. That's the thing. Wow. So, yeah, okay. No, this is not. Maybe I'll have to stand here.
Okay.
So I thought I'd say something about myself first. I'm an environmental economist. I work quite a lot on discounting, the theory of discounting, growth, that kind of thing, and quite a lot on the design of policy instruments. Just today, although it's been going on for 3 years, we've been working for 3 years, a group of about 26 authors. We just got an article published in Sustainability, which is about policy design for the animals. This period of time when man himself is the greatest force actually affecting the vital signs of the planet, the temperature, the ozone layer, the acidity of the ocean, those things. So it is, in fact, there is a very early article by Kenneth Boulding called something like Spaceship Earth. We are like in a, we're flying a spaceship, we have to learn how to drive it, and so this is policy design. Now today we'll speak about the most important of these challenges of planetary balance, which is that of the atmospheric content of gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and others that affect temperature. As a little nice coincidence that it did give me a bit of a headache last week, we got a Nobel Prize announced, and the headache was because I was on television commenting on this prize, and I said something slightly critical of Nordhaus, and my friends in the academy who had selected him got a little upset. So I spent some time looking into and discussing these issues. So this is Romer to the left, who has worked on putting in endogenous growth into putting in endogenous technical development into growth models. And to the right we have Nordhaus, who has worked on integrating climate. Now, the same day almost, we got an announcement of the IPCC 1.5 degree report. And this is a smaller report. IPCC usually works in cycles of about years with the, and I was part, as you mentioned, of the annual, of the AR5 report. Now, in this, we have here the 1.5. I don't know if this was reported heavily in Israeli television. So there was this Korean gentleman, the president of the IPCC, saying that it's not impossible, but rather difficult. So we've been struggling, just look at this diagram here. We've been struggling, we've been talking about climate change since back here, and that we should reduce emissions, and we haven't even succeeded in stabilizing them. Now, to reach 1.5 degrees, we would have to, basically, emissions would have to drop like a stone. And that is truly difficult, quite clearly. Actually, Swedish goals are completely aligned with this. And there is quite a large expansion of solar power, even in our Arctic country. There's also efforts, for instance, to reform the steel industry. We have a large steel industry in Sweden. One of the most difficult industries to go for, because if you know the chemistry, then coal is actually used as a raw material, and you need the sea atom to knock off some oxygen from basically the iron ore in order to reduce the iron ore to iron. But they have developed methods to do this with hydrogen instead. And it's going to take this. I bring this up because this is a case where actually a price on carbon, which is our favorite instrument, would not be enough. You need industrial policy, you need massive arrangements between big states and big steel industries to make a transition like that. And that is actually being planned. So I might come back to that a little bit more. But now I want to go back to Nordhaus. So, Nordhaus's models, the IPCC says that 2 degrees warming would be too dangerous. We should aim for 1.5. Nordhaus labels 3.5 as optimal. So, basically, definitely Nordhaus has been a pioneer, and he has developed a model that is the DICE model, that is used by everybody, including by his critics. But his conclusions are quite out of sync with the natural science community, which is thinking we should be below 2 degrees generally. So, I want to speak about the Paris negotiations. I'll try to put these a little bit into context. We were living in Paris, in fact, when during these negotiations, and the year before I was at Collège de France as a guest. And I want to point in particular here to this word here, tax. And now this thing is, can't move away from my little cover here. Anyway, all the most prominent economists in the world were saying that there is one word that is most important. Nordhaus, Weizmann, Jean Tirole. Jean Tirole took an initiative to write a letter to the IPCC, and saying that the most important thing you could do was to put a price on carbon. I signed the letter. And, you know, if a Nobel Prize winner asks you to sign a letter saying something that you think is fairly obvious, it's quite an easy choice. I didn't expect to be besieged by about 20 of my good friends in Paris asking me to unsign the letter. Because the team of people working around the chairmanship of the French chairmanship for the Paris negotiation, they were convinced that if we put the word price and carbon in there, we would not have had a treaty. Saudi Arabia would not have signed, the United States would not have signed, and a lot of other countries would have been quite pleased not to sign as well. So there wouldn't have been a treaty. And the question is, does it matter? Did the Paris agreement mean anything? I don't think this is a question that is very easy to answer, that has an easy answer. There's lots of countries, so in the IPCC, many of my friends, now I'm joking here, but like children, they like to fill in, maps with colors. And this is the result. So it shows some progress because you have this map in 1 year, and then you get more and more colors. The trouble is that people don't recognize you have to have a relatively high price of carbon in order to have an effect. A tiny price, $1 or $5 a ton, is not going to make a difference. So many of these countries have a meaninglessly low carbon price, sometimes at the same time as they also have subsidies. So this shows here all the stuff at the bottom here is the countries that have a price of carbon very close to zero. And one country happens to be my country. I'm not normally very chauvinistic, but in this particular case, Sweden has got a very high. And in fact, I had the joy, I worked for a year and a half in New York at something called the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a very large and powerful lobby organization for the environment. We have a budget of $700 million and 500 employees. And so I would go to the Hill, as it's called, in Washington, Capitol Hill, and talk to senators and congressmen about carbon taxes. And I designed a model, staff at EDF had designed a model with a $5 and a $10 tax. And they would look at this and they would say, that's a lot of revenue. The government was closing because they didn't have funds for this. It's a bit embarrassing. So many of the senators and congressmen I spoke to, they said that would be good with the revenue. And then they say, yeah, and it's good for the climate. So that's good. But then they would say, on the other hand, politically, there'd be such resistance. You can't imagine, having such a high carbon tax as $5 or $10. And I would always politely say, yes, but I understand, or really I don't, actually, because I come from a country where the price on carbon is $180 a ton, and no life just goes on. We don't use oil for heating anymore, and we use wood, and we develop all kinds of efficiency and stuff. Life goes on, the economy goes on. The Swedish economy is doing better than the average in Europe. So, really, now these are oil prices here in history, so back to 1860, and they've been falling in real terms until 1970, when there was the oil crisis, and then they've been going up and down. If we took climate change seriously, then the policy instruments, that is the tax on carbon or the price of policy permits, if we use trade permits, would be higher than the price of oil. But in fact, I just put in the very top European trading scheme price down there. You see it? So we have to add that to the price of oil. Doesn't make much difference, right? The Swedish carbon taxes has risen, started in 1990, and it is today roughly the same size as the price of oil. So we got to double the price. Now, just to give some perspective on climate negotiations, we've been talking about climate for many years, and in Copenhagen, where I was also present at this COP, well, no, not in this room, which is a very exclusive group of people here, all looking sadly powerless. As there were a lot of expectations that Copenhagen would succeed. And the sort of public media perception of this is that Copenhagen failed and then Paris succeeded. The French like to think that perhaps their diplomacy was better, their contacts, or the fact that they didn't mention the tax on carbon, or something else. But really, the two agreements are extremely different. So it's hard to compare. And in Copenhagen, there was actually an attempt to divide up who does what in abatement. And by the way, I'm convinced that that was the reason why Copenhagen failed, because they actually tried to, and I've done some research, I've written quite a few papers on this with colleagues who do willingness to pay surveys. We've studied in several different countries, in China, in the US, and in Europe, the willingness to pay for doing something about the climate. It turns out, and we looked at the interaction of that and the willingness to pay for fairness, or that is how much are you willing to pay for the climate, is one question. Another question, how much are you willing to pay if other countries are doing as much so that the distribution will be fair? And we found that the willingness to pay for fairness was very high. People are prepared to do something for the climate, but only if other countries are doing as much. So everybody wants fairness. The trouble is, we have completely opposite concepts of fairness. The United States, seriously, even my friends in the United States, and I'm not mainly the same people as were friends with Trump, but even my liberal environmental economists, they all think that grandfathering is fair. So basically we all do 50% reduction by some year. But my friends in India don't think that's fair. They've been lecturing in India, they've been lecturing in Africa. They think we should have the same emissions per capita. So you see here, these three words here are crucial. Because the difference between equal abatement and equal percentage abatement is billions of dollars. Billions that the Indians would want, the Africans would want, and the Americans would want. And so that's why climate negotiations are tough. Now in Paris, it was like a New Year's declaration. Do you have New Year's declarations?
You don't celebrate.
You don't actually accept it. But
מתי נתניהו נואם לאומה? ביום העצמאות? Independence Day declaration.
That's a different. I think that's a different kind of declaration.
No.
So in Europe, exactly. People say I will lose 2 kilos. So the Paris Declaration is very much like that. We're not going to gain more than 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. But there's nothing about how or who. There's no distribution of effort. So it is a New Year's resolution. And some people say that maybe therefore it's useless. But here we need to be humble as economists and dialogue with political scientists and philosophers and historians and others, because it is possible that we need to think in terms of political process, and that you need first a political process where the key word is unanimity, and maybe even the term INDC is individual, nationally determined contribution. This is an oxymoron when it comes to creating a public good. You don't create a public good by each one sending what he wants to the state. You have to have some kind of coercion, of course. Everybody has to provide equal amounts. But we don't have that in Paris. But maybe you need this voluntary approach and unanimity first, and then 5 years later you might be prepared, ready to start putting in tougher instruments. That's a difficult question. Anyway, just Paris and these climate negotiations have created quite a concern about stranded assets. And the finance community has said, be careful, because if you have tough policy instruments for climate, you may bring down the coal industry. It is so valuable. This could, is much bigger than the housing bubble. This could bring down the banks and create a global recession. This is a bit of a threat as well. But anyway, it might be true for that reason. So that's why we're kind of interested in, is one of the reasons to be interested in this. Now, here comes the paper, right? That was the long introduction. The paper is a question of really what it is that decides the share value of fossil industries. And you can conceptually imagine you spend $1 million buying coal shares today and you sell them tomorrow. Traders do that. And the question is, every day do you make a positive return or a negative return? And is this return affected by things like the Trump election? So you can just look, just looking at this visually, you can see that in fact here there is a 5-year period here from 2011 to 2016 when coal shares actually lose 80-90% of their value. So there is a movement in these shares. But did anything in particular happen at the date of the Paris Agreement? And you can't see that's here. You see a bit of volatility perhaps, but you don't actually see any movement. And there's a whole lot of, we start looking at this in detail. There's many different things that happen. Right? The COP in Lima really, in a way, started defining the agenda, even back in Durban. Here's the Paris Agreement, where the day when the agreement is sort of reached, and then there's signature of the important countries, and then there's the election of Trump and his promise to withdraw from the treaty, and his nomination of Pruitt as the head of the EPA. All these things, Pruitt represented the most extreme candidate that was being considered. There was hope that Trump was perhaps just being sort of beating his chest before the election and would be more reasonable afterwards, but it turned out he was in fact going to continue beating his chest. So all of these events could be influencing the price of coal. And the methodology we use is quite common in financial markets. Very often you look at things like the CEO dying or a new CEO coming in or effects of a merger or something like that. and you look at, you build a small model for the returns, and then when there's unexpected new information, you observe abnormal returns. We have also spoken to Sir David Henry, who is one of the best econometricians in the world, and has developed exciting new econometric methodology that is an alternative route, and that we have used. Basically saying that you first build the best model you can, and then you test as much as possible, and you also test every day is a potential outlier without specifying the events beforehand. So you put in more dummies, as many dummies as there are observations, which sounds as if it was not going to be possible for those of us who have only taken the first courses in econometrics, but it turns out it is possible to do this. So here's a model. I mean, we have quite a simple model, basically regressing the returns of the industries that interest us on the Dow Jones or on the average market performance to capture the sort of business cycle and interest rate and other. We could have more advanced models that would take differences in risk or volatility and so on into account. And that's something we might do in the future. People have been advising us that it might not make a difference with the short windows that we are looking at. But basically, we estimate the model, and then we have a red window and look at the results. And we have a number of different industries. And the interesting thing is the physics of energy tells us that when you burn coal to have a certain amount of energy, you emit more carbon dioxide than the same amount of energy from oil, and with gases the other way around is less. So you would expect the biggest effect on coal, moderate effect on oil, and gas, you don't know, it could even be possibly the opposite effect. It would be relatively favored by a mild climate policy compared to coal and oil. Of course, then we have nuclear energy and clean energy, renewable energies, and they would typically, you would expect them to do well. When it comes to the unexpectedness of the collected data on this is betting data. In fact, there's both polling data and betting data, but all the data shows that just as I think the public perception has it, that in fact it's hard to use the word likelihood afterwards, but the perceived likelihood at the time of Clinton winning was really very high, and so the election of Trump was truly, to a very large extent, unexpected. That of course doesn't mean the probability was zero, right? The perceived probability just days before was considered to be 10–15%. It was a big surprise. Now here we can see some effects on the Paris Agreement. I have a lot of data. I don't see a clock. I'd love to know how much time I want to spend. 20 minutes. So I won't go through all the results because there's lots of these results. But basically, this is very typical. We see here for coal a little bit of an effect that is significant this is for a window of 2 days here, 2 days before until the Paris Agreement. Here is another window, 1 day before, 1 day after. Which most of the windows we look at are not significant. Sometimes we see an effect for oil, sometimes it's the wrong order. Gas seems to be more effective than oil than coal. The results don't really conform very well to our expectations. And solar does, however, do quite well. But there's no effect on nuclear, little on these other alternative technologies. Well, this is a methodological note. Of course, when you do an event study, you look at the companies that exist. If a company goes bankrupt in the middle of your data set, it drops out. So of course, we could, if there were a lot of bankruptcies, this could be biasing our results. Potentially in two ways. So first of all, because it's missing a piece of data. Obviously, companies that go bankrupt are affected. That's bad. On the other hand, the companies that are left could be benefited. If your competitor goes bankrupt, could be good for you. So all this is complicated. We have looked at it. There is not, so the Paris Agreement is here, the Trump election year after. There's not any particular sign that bankruptcies are heavily related to correlated. There seems to be a relatively constant number of bankruptcies. There are two different kinds of bankruptcy in the US. This is just using another index instead of equity traded funds. So I'll skip one or two things. And here we look at the coal industry in different countries. You can imagine that, particularly for the Trump election, you can imagine that Trump is not just an enemy of climate policy, but he's also specifically wants to help the coal producers. Or you could think he's either going to help the utilities who use the coal or the miners who produce it. And depending on whether he's helping the supply side or the demand side, the effect would be a little bit different, and they would be a little bit different for the countries that maybe would be selling oil and coal to the United States. So we look into different countries. There's just a hell of a lot of data, and but I can tell you, we don't find very many interesting. We find some effects here and there. And here, for instance, we have some effects in Trump, and of course it's the other way around, so they're negative for renewables. But you see, there's nothing significant, and it even looks regularly negative here, even for the fossil fuels. Of course, there's lots of interpretations of this. We'll come back to that in a moment. I want to move to here, output. So here we have to try harder to find effects. We've taken the difference as our indicator, the difference of what happens to coal and what happens to renewables. Since whatever we think is going to happen will happen on the same day, we have we have a good correlation here, and so we get a more sensitive indicator. So we look at the difference of what happens to fossil fuels to what happens to renewables, and we have used this impulse indicator saturation method. So we have not we have all days are possible days, and in fact we get some interesting results. We find, as expected here, that Paris has positive effects. So it's good for renewables, bad for fossils. It's a 6% effect. It's significant. We find the US election has exactly the opposite sign and is again a 6% effect. We find a number of other dates. And I think I have that slide here. So we have a number of other dates which we find, and all these dates are the significant things that happen. So, for instance, the Chinese premier said, made an announcement about Chinese policy on the 5th of March, and actually the same day, and two days, and Bloomberg reporting a major shift in energy storage, which is beneficial for renewables, and so on. The 20th of May, for instance, President Hollande gave a speech saying that he didn't think the Paris negotiations would work. That was an important moment in its own way. Now, sort of a bit of summing up this result, we find very limited market response. This stands in contrast to the media reporting. Now, I read the media reporting mainly in Paris, but we have done a content analysis. We had some media specialists to read the Financial Times systematically, coding all the paragraphs, and they showed also that there was a media reporting saying that this was a great success. We don't really see much evidence of that in financial markets. And of course, the two key words are here, surprising and strong. Should we be surprised about all this? There is an alternative interpretation. The alternative interpretation is that the fundamental underlyings are technological. I have a friend who's a professor of really international star and professor when it comes to energy technology. He had this wonderful line. He said, just before Paris, he said, Paris is the last opportunity for the politicians of the world to solve this problem. Otherwise, it will solve itself. Now, he's far out on the technology optimism end of things, but he's an expert. He knows just how cheap solar energy is in India and all this kind of technological information. He knows the rate of progress of battery research. So he thinks that the underlying technology is the main explanation, and that things like Paris and Trump election get more media attention than they perhaps deserve compared to the underlying technology. And that, of course, is one spin on this. There's also an interesting sort of policy conclusion spin, because perhaps we don't have to be so worried about this issue of stranded fossil assets, because that's been used as a bit of a threat. If we do too much climate policy, the whole financial market will come crashing down. So we don't really see very clear signs of that. In fact, we see very small effects. So I tried my best to simple down. And I was over prepared, so I mean, I can talk about this for about 5 weeks if you like. And I have a number of other things that more slides, and we could talk about, fairness and international treaties, or what signs there are carbon taxation will be sufficient, renewables, green bonds. I've been working quite a lot on green bonds that are perhaps a promise for financing green technologies. A bit about the coincidence of the fact that we have a crisis of nature and a crisis of politics, in my opinion, at the same time. And the final thing here, a little card game that anybody's interested, this is to educate yourself for the breaks. There's a card game that I can mention here on what you can do yourself to learn and teach friends about how much carbon there is when you eat vegetarian compared to eating meat, or if you take a shower or don't take a shower, take a long shower, short shower, all these daily things like taking the airplane. So I have a number of others. You can ask that. You feel free to ask whatever you like. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some more time. We have questions for Thomas. This is the time. We have here several professionals in event status analysis.
Maybe I should ask your help. This is the first event study I do, and I'm guiding a PhD student from Zimbabwe who is doing this. And of course, we're looking for expert help. And we want to know if we did what we could properly, the technology.
But basically, your interesting results are with the econometric analysis.
Well, that is interesting in two ways. I mean, partly because of the David Henry's methodology, I think is a little bit new in this context, and partly because of the results, which I didn't really expect. That's not a surprise.
So you did get the results that you expected, but with the econometric method.
Yeah, but weaker result than I expected. I actually didn't think there would be a stronger result.
Really?
So that's nice. I mean, it was a nice study to do in a way, because I knew there would be a paper either way. If there's no effect or if there is a big effect, either way it is. Sometimes the paper dies if you get the wrong results. Here it really has an interesting challenge to interpret it either way, I think.
We're establishing here the Jane Goodall Institute of Israel, and so this is my first year, and we had a meeting with Professor Dr. Khalaknik and establishing the environmental economy that she is establishing here. So I come from Africa, from Mali. And what we're doing there is we have programs for sustainability to combat the coal industry. So we are working on the chimpanzee side of the story to protect the chimpanzee cultures and protect the indigenous communities living alongside them. So every community that joins our project, we give a village 500 trees. And then we're hoping to make, right now we have 11 cultures, 11 tribes who have signed up to our peace program with the chimpanzees. So if they promise to protect the chimpanzees, we give them 500 trees. And in order to make a green buffer zone to stop desertification, because we found science found that the trees create their own rain and their own weather patterns. So by doing so, we can stop the water wars, which will be a great crisis in the near future, especially given the refugees. So I would like to ask you, in terms of you said nature is in crisis, if you can elaborate on that, because you said you had a project in Africa now as well.
So I've been training PhD students from 4 countries for many decades, and we have, with these students, created something that we call the Environment for Development Initiative. So together with Resources for the Future in Washington, Gothenburg and some other institutes, we have about a dozen satellite institutes. One of these is in Ethiopia, which is a country with some superficial similarities, at least to Mali. And I've been several times recently in Ethiopia and talked, and there have been representatives of the government there. It's quite striking. Ethiopia wants to become a middle-income country in like 15 years. This is incredible. They are so far from a middle-income country that they need to grow faster than China, to get there. The second part of this miracle is they say they want to do this without increasing their emissions. And that sounds, first of all, very unselfish. It's nice, there are rich countries not doing very much about the climate change. And here, one of the world's poorest countries, one of Africa's poorest countries, wants to help with the global good, so that's very nice of them. They also have, they happen to have some very spectacular conditions. They are going to dam the Nile, which is a very controversial idea, to put it mildly. And but they're also going to, put up a lot of solar power, wind power, and reforest the country, which has been like 95% deforested. So there's a lot of interesting things there, and of course green finance would play a very big role in this. I would think, and I've looked quite a lot at these, what are the growth prospects for a country like Mali or Ethiopia? I don't think they can easily compete in, who knows, but it's not immediate that they're going to compete in the steel industry or in mechanical engineering or in computing and communications. Maybe things like agriculture, forestry, maybe things like culture tourism, ecotourism. They have unique assets in the wildlife in these countries. So it seems very logical, the connection you make. Otherwise, it might seem far-fetched for someone who comes from the town. But making a connection between chimpanzees and forestry on the one hand and climate change and energy issues on the other, I think is quite logical. Because why would you go to Mali? And, well, one of the reasons probably is if it has nicer wildlife than the next Africa. chance that a country like Mali has, and Ethiopia, for instance, used to have an enormous amount of on paper they have great national parks. In reality, the national parks are full of cows, and the cows are kind of starving too. So there's very little, there's hardly tree cover there, and tourism has dropped totally. People go to South Africa and Kenya for wildlife experience. So it's a very logical thing to do for Mali, I think.
I've noticed exactly like you said, the cultural heritage aspect of the cultural importance of a nation. In Mali, we found out that the chimpanzees have shown the indigenous tribes how to use specific plants to combat diseases. Because the chimpanzees were there before the indigenous tribes arrived, and they learned to adapt with malaria and different parasites. So the indigenous people saw which types of medicinal plants the chimpanzees use, and what we're wanting to do is to synthesize and to document these medicinal plants and to make connections with local universities there and colleges to identify, because I think the issue of indigenous knowledge of plants and like you said about the importance of animals, I think this could give us drugs that we never learned about.
And to do it so fast and so smart that if you actually succeed in getting a drug, that the revenue really goes to the local people who, because it's hard. It's hard. There is this issue of the proprietary nature. I mean, it takes a long time for a drug company to develop a drug that is commercially successful, and in the end they end up making most of the money. This is also there's another relationship between climate and drugs it is a market failure. It's clear that carbon dioxide is not priced, and that is a market failure, it's an externality. But there's also a missing property rights to intellectual property there. If someone discovers a drug that helps stop AIDS or cancer or something else, will we respect the patent rights? I think, suppose some US company comes up with this. I think countries like India, China, South Africa, they will say, no, we have 100 million people suffering here. We're not going to pay an American company several billion. We're just going to copy the drug. So I don't want to pass judgment on that. I just want to say I think that's true. I think it's the same with climate change. I think that if some company comes up with a smart way to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and make it into stones or fuel or something, we will steal that invention. It's too important to respect the past. Someone's going to steal it. And the companies know this. And therefore there is not enough research spontaneously from the market into renewable energy and into adaptation to climate change and such things. And this is a reason that even free market economists would respect for a public state intervention. That there is a reason why you would spend public money and should spend public money in subsidizing renewable research.
Okay. I think that we will thank you for
Thank you very much.
Great lecture.
בדקתי איתו, הוא בדרך, הוא פשוט אצלחולים אחרים.
מי? הנשיא? אז יהיה לנו כמה דקות לאכול ביניהם. כן, would you like to make a picture?